Welcome, everyone, to the Dig On series Zoom panel discussion on the spirit of osteopathy and the nature of being. My name is Arlene Dijamco, and I think I know many of you, and I'll be your host for today. So we have an absolutely amazing panel here with three fellows of the American Academy of Osteopathy, Hollis King DO, Hruby DO, Hruby DO, with decades of service to the profession and humanity, and they've contributed to the discussion of the spirit in osteopathy over many years. Lee is also the author of Interface, Mechanisms of Spirit and Osteopathy. And to represent a younger generation, we also have Heather Bird DO here, who has a special interest in exploring if and how osteopathic physicians are integrating spirit into their practice. So it's an absolute honor and joy to have all of you here, and for everyone that's participating live or watching the recording later. This is really a sacred space that we're creating here. For the interest in time to learn more about each of our panelists, I'll put the brochure into the chat in just a little bit, and you can read more about them there. The vision for this Zoom is to create a safe space to share. There's no need to convince or create a consensus. We hope by sharing that we will enrich each other's individual experience and perhaps to inspire. Everyone has their own unique individual journey and perspective, and we are all here somehow connected. So we'll never finish discussing what is infinite, but that doesn't need to keep us from starting. So that is part of the fun of living the process. My mission has been to bring the intuitive spirit back to medicine in practical and tangible ways. So part of that includes normalizing conversations on topics that are core to our being. So we're going to have the courage to continue to dig on and speak from our hearts. Dr. A.T. Still wrote a section entitled Man is Triune, which appears in the Philosophy and Mechanical Principles of Osteopathy, 1902, page 16, so early on. Still writes, first, there is a material body. Second, the spiritual being. Third, a being of mind, which is far superior to all vital motions and material forms, whose duty is to wisely manage this great engine of life. So we're going to continue the conversation that both Paul Lee and Hollis King presented at the evening with the FAAOs at Convo a couple of weeks ago. They reviewed that the osteopathic principles include that the body is a unit of body, mind, and spirit. You can find that written on the AOA and AACOM websites. They also reviewed how spirituality and religion are not synonymous. Spirituality transcends religion. And as Hollis said, you can't blame religion on God. I have some questions for the panelists that will cover many of the questions that were submitted. We'll also leave some time at the end for a Q&A. So if you have questions or comments, please submit them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. I think let's just take a few deep cleansing breaths just to set the space for this kind of conversation. So at your pace, just nice big breaths in and out. Thank you. So to get a layout of the land, I wanted to know first from Heather, what do you see is the interest in addressing spirit and osteopathy from the younger generations?
Yeah, hi Arlene and everybody else. So I'm faculty out at Kirksville, Missouri. I watch over a group of residents out there, and about a year ago, I started asking the question, how are we practitioners of spirit, or how are we incorporating that into our practices? So the thing that kind of got me was when I got on the website and it was talking about mind, body, and spirit on the AOA as being physicians that we address the wholeness of our patients. Um, I don't remember seeing this much in the curriculum on how to do this, so this is a big question in my mind too. So I wrote a protocol for a card study with Dr. Dagenhart, and through the research, the Osteopathic Research Center in Kirksville. And we asked the question, after each encounter of 10 encounters, when the physician comes out, did you address the spirit of your patient, yes or no? This is a qualitative study, so we're also looking at themes here. And if the answer is yes, then how did you do it? Or what do you think you did to address this? And if the answer is no, well, that's a whole nother conversation of why are we not addressing the spirit in our practices. So at the end of this study, we're going to open this through the DO Touch Network, which we haven't done yet, but this is the plan moving forward, to get a large data collection and look at the themes that come up, if there is a pattern of themes that come up, and hopefully we can start writing curriculum around what could come out of this research. That is where I am hopeful. The residents, we have conversations about this regularly, and it seems that everybody is doing something of a spiritual nature. Some is more etheric, and some are more just in conversation. But we're seeking out the themes, and be ready for, if you are part of the DO Touch Network, be ready to implement this into your practice as well, and look for curriculum coming out. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much. And then for our FAAOs, just looking at, through the decades and from the start of osteopathy with Still, what is your impression of this interest in the spirit of osteopathy?
Paul? I was waiting for you, Hollis. I feel like the interest in spirituality might be increasing, but I can't really say because when I was at Kirksville in 1985, I recognized the same thing you did, Heather, that we were not teaching what Dr. Still implied was the basis of his philosophy, which dealt with spirit. And so um, I got to sit and read all of his writings, and there it was. It was like, what are we doing here? We're not teaching what he wanted us to teach. So my motivation, just like yours, Heather, has been to try to instill an interest in that. And what's interesting is, if I might share a slide here. Where is it? I can't seem to bring it up.
At the bottom of the screen, there's a share
Yeah,
caret,
I hit that.
and then you might hit the advanced sharing options, and I'll show you options.
I'm just going to read it. I can read it.
Okay.
How often in this day, this is Roland Becker in 1997. How often in this day and time do we hear reference made to the master mechanic of the human body, the grand architect, God, deity, creator, or other terms of reverence for the maker of the human temple in which we reside? These are the terms of the science of osteopathy as envisioned by Andrew Taylor Still. There it is. So I'm not sure what interest there is, since I'm not in touch with a lot of students, etc. But what do you think, Hollis? What do you think, Ray?
Ray. I I think, first of all, Paul, I agree with you to an extent. I have this feeling that there's an increase generally in this interest of working on the spirit in osteopathy. Um, and I'm not sure about that. It's more of intuition than knowledge. So, but when I kind of broach these subjects with students or other colleagues, I don't feel like I get uh, a kind of silent pushback or whatever you want to call it, you know, that I used to feel in the past. So I think there's a growing interest. Um, and how it got to be this way, I'm not sure. Truthfully, some of what I think about that is based on Paul's book. I think in Paul's book he does a good job of expressing the idea that in osteopathy we speak of body, mind, and spirit. A.T. Still spoke of the law of mind, matter, and motion. The terms I think are all equal in that regard. Um, but historically, I think the profession started out, as I saw it, DOs feeling like they had a complete system of medicine that they wanted to practice. And as we know, the history initially not being legal to practice and over time becoming legal. I think at the expense of some of the spirit. As the profession grew, we seemed to gain more privileges and rights in some ways, if you want to look at it that way, by sort of bending towards the standard of medicine in those times. So we increase our curriculums to become more and more allopathic looking to some extent, and still try to keep osteopathy in there. So some of that had to have an effect on, I think, kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of erasing the spirit part of the mind, body, and spirit in osteopathy over time. But I do feel like there's a revival of that going on in the same time. And I agree with again with Paul. We're quoting A.T. Still in different ways here. Over time, I learned that A.T. Still was a clairvoyant. And that kind of struck me in a way too. The quote from his autobiography that I got to get a quote in here. Everybody else did. So, but he said that I will say that the river of intelligence is just as close to you and yours as it is to me and mine. That was one of the very first quotes I heard by A.T. Still, not from A.T. Still. People might accuse me of that, I know, but from Dr. Fryman. And Dr. Viola Fryman was one of the earliest DOs that I ran into who I thought had a true grasp of the full depth and meaning of osteopathy. And I remember in a discussion in one of her classes, she quoted that. And it strikes me that over the years that people who are enlightened, shall we call it, Still was enlightened in some ways. When I read his works now, I see him in a different light. Like literally, what did he actually see when he was looking at people and intuit from that? And so, it occurs to me that people like Still, or anybody that you would say was enlightened in some way or somehow elevated in some way. So I'm not equating all these people, but anybody that you think might be like that, often they're more religious sounding, God, Buddha, Jesus, anybody that you could see that was enlightened. It occurs to me that when you read about them and the things they say, it's once they're enlightened, it seems like they have a great deal of difficulty trying to convey that to others. Except there's one thing that they all seem to convey, is that it's always within us. They all say something to the effect that, you can do this too. We, like typical students, want the user's manual, from them. We want, okay, so what are the steps we take to do it? But yet the message is you can do it, but it comes from within. And so it becomes an individual path to develop this spirituality. And hence two things. Maybe we're not motivated to do the work that gets there. And I see seeming contradictions in it, that it seems like the less you chase that sort of, I'll just use the word enlightenment, if you will, for that kind of knowledge. The less you chase it, the more available I think it is to you somehow. So just like in cranial work, we talk about feeling the primary respiratory mechanism and listening to it, not doing things, allowing it to do what it needs to do. We need to be able to be aware of this, and yet we need to, in many ways, not pursue it like it needs to come to us in each in our own way. Hence, we then have at least some confusion between the ideas of spirituality, religion. I think I would throw another one in there. Spirituality and religion can't be separate and distinct things. We talk about life and holism, whether we call that a vital force, still called it biogen. And even that, is that still separate from a deity or a supreme being that we might throw into there? So I'm not at this point sure what the question was, but that was my answer. So.
Ray, picking up on what you say, I'm going to cut to the chase and offer a thought that I think is true, that we are all spiritual beings having a physical experience. We're in Earth School, learning all the lessons of loving one another. And that when it comes to healthcare, osteopathy has the best to offer because of the body, mind, spirit thrust. Carl Jung said, "The world is changing, and I am on the transition team. Awaken and shine your light for others to follow." I believe osteopathy is doing that for healthcare, that we are on the transition team for healthcare, and it is in bringing in this spirit in whatever fashion we can in our practice. At Convo a couple of weeks ago, Paul and I talked about spiritually based energy medicine practices that lend itself well to our general osteopathic treatment. I see some Brits here. John Wernham, didn't he teach the GOT, the general osteopathic treatment? Well, I did that for years and then added cranial to it. But I have found, and picking up on Ray's comment of the cranial primary respiratory mechanism, that if you're in touch with that and with the embryologic development of the physical body, you can engage the person's spiritual inner capacity, even if they have never thought about it. And you have to help the patient awaken that. And when I've done that in the last 20 years with my zero alpha point procedure, the patients do start to talk about spiritual things. So I think this is the kind of element that we can integrate through osteopathy. Barbara Briner years ago practiced the esoteric healing of Alice Bailey, and many of our DO colleagues use Reiki and other energy medicine oriented practices that fit into osteopathy. And the wonderful thing is, here in the US, I get to bill OMT for doing this energy work, that you have to integrate it in and not make it sound weird for people. I've always had the advantage is that I worked for 4 years with Viola Fryman, And so I kind of had her eccentric reputation put on me so I could talk about these things with patients. And I am hopeful that each of us can use this inner resource, our spiritual being. I worked with Tim Maris in the UK. He has a wonderful book where he talks about centering yourself before you do the cranial work. And I don't know how many DOs take that deep breath to relax, like Arlene guided us in the beginning of this session, to center ourselves, to be, oriented. So what I'm suggesting is that a group like this, with Sue Bird's and DO TouchNet research, how do we encourage a spiritual component? We don't want to be, in outside the US, you're practicing osteopathy in accord with the rules of your country. And here in the US, we're doing medicine. And so you have certain limits to just how you can integrate this in. But if the patient experiences something of a spiritual nature, it is an advancement, because I think our spirituality and emotions determine our physical health. And so it's essential for optimum health to deal with these aspects of people, the spirit, however you want to define it. So that's my, as Ray would say, my 2 centavos worth of indirect initial comment.
This
3.14159.265 pesos.
This is great. And
you have to be from California to really get into
to echo what all of you are saying, like, we are all spiritual beings. And I'm going to read something that William Lemley wrote in his article, summer 2002 of the AAO Journal. He said that one can meet the patient's spiritual needs in several ways. First, simply be trustworthy and kind, treating the patient as a person, always maintaining hope and assisting the patient in determining what it means to live. In addressing an American Medical Association convention, Rabbi Abraham Herschel said, "To heal a person, one must first be a person. Patients are first and foremost persons. Is it not time that one recognizes that physicians are also first and foremost persons? One of the most important aspects of spirituality is that the doctor-patient relationship is a sanctuary that can only be effectively entered with a sense of love, humility, and awe." Now, just to speak from the greater world and also the MD world, there is, I feel, a rise in interest of spirit in medicine overall, whether that came about over the decades or even more recently through COVID. And we know through our own experiences, but also even in the medical literature, that when we are faced with time surrounding birth, death, or serious illness, then people tend to more seriously contemplate spirit and the nature of our being. And in Ray, in your Letters to Still column in the AAO Journal, winter 2007, you highlighted a couple of lines from Dr. Still on death. And you quoted him, "Death is the completed work of development of the sum total of effort to a finished work of nature." That's from both Still and the Living, page 33, and Autobiography, page 245. Another line is, "What is death but a birth from the second placenta to which life has been attached?" That's also from Still and the Living, page 38, and Osteopathy Research and Practice, page 20. And, for this group, I want to read the more full quote from that last one. And this is from Osteopathy Research and Practice. "I will now ask, what is his second condition? Is not this physical form, this intellectual man, a placenta in principle? A placenta for the purpose of constructing a greater being which we call life. We will call life. What is death but a birth from the second placenta to which life has been attached? If this philosophy is true, death is only the delivery of the finished life whose perfection is far superior to the intellectual man, the maternal house of construction, which is left behind. It is a known fact that human life is progressive and that it prepares to proceed with the labor of accumulation and practice of knowledge. It is reasonable to conclude that after what is known as physical death, the life is then and there qualified to enter the higher school to continue its mental development. In all this, nature had some great object in view. My conclusion is that immortality is the design or object of nature's God and the production of man. Now, I read this not to place any belief on anyone, but to understand where Still was coming from. And to have these conversations, I feel it's important to look at those times when we're very close to pure spirit. And so I'm going to ask our panelists, what are your experiences, whether personal and professional, and reflections on birth and death? And how do these experiences influence your practice of osteopathy? And, I want to note from Dr. Gladys McGarry, whose parents were also students of A.T. Still, being healthy is not always the absence of disease. And death is also not necessarily the absence of healing. Healing can come in many ways.
Thank you. Thank you for reading those quotes. I'm always glad to find somebody who reads that stuff. But it triggers a lot of thoughts in me, as it did then. I think that for one thing, I mentioned earlier, and I think we all have, what is spirituality? Where is religion in that? Is religion in that? Can it be part of that? Those kinds of things. I did some searching on the internet several times recently, and noticed that some of the articles that I found that talked about spirituality in medicine turned out to be about religion and medicine. So, like I say, we tend to use the terms interchangeably, and I think we tend to get lost down some rabbit holes trying to find the true meaning. And I don't mean that religion doesn't belong in there, but we seem to fall towards that one. I think it's kind of human nature. At the same time, there's a transcendency about it. Still, if I can interpret his life a little bit, he started out in a Methodist family, with his father being a Methodist preacher. But you read his works, he kind of it looks like he kind of drifted away from that form of worship. He got into spirituality. He somehow found his clairvoyance, and he speaks of these kinds of things. This to me symbolized that we are bound to be delivered into again, I don't know a better term, some type of afterlife in which we would be hopefully a more highly developed being of some kind, and gain more knowledge. So in terms of spirituality, that's where I see there's a transcendence over religion and lots of other things that we certainly can't include in spirituality, but we need to keep a focus on a greater thing even beyond that, I guess,
In the history of osteopathy, the author uses some quotations from Dr. Still that you don't find anywhere else. And one of the quotations that he used was a very long one in which Dr. Still described his search for what life is. And it was like a baby seeking its mother's milk. He was so hungry to understand that. He said, this is beyond anything. I would sacrifice anything to understand this. And then he went on to say that the preacher didn't have the answers, the materialist didn't have the answers, but the one that had the answers was the spiritualist medium. And so there's evidence right there that he attended seances and found comfort to his soul, as he described it, in that experience of the seance, because he understood that there was life after death. And he goes on to say in another quotation, I do not understand a preacher's business. I have not made a study of the Bible for that purpose. But the knowledge that I have gained of the construction of man convinces me of the supreme wisdom of the deity. That tells me right there that religion is not his main focus, but instead spirituality is. And I think that's a strong distinction that we can make here. Spirituality is how the person is united with their higher essence, whereas religion is how people are united in a common belief system. And they have a book to which they refer in many cases in religion. But in spirituality, it's more personal, as you mentioned earlier, Ray. It's a personal experience. And that's how we connect with our higher essence, which the primary respiratory mechanism demonstrates. And this is how I find I can make spirituality practical. Primary respiration is an expression of spirit. The fluctuation of the cerebral spinal fluid is a reflection of the spirit. The fluctuation of the Traubeheering wave in the arteries is a reflection of spirit. The fluctuation within the interstitial fluids is an expression of spirit. And so we can use that. We can connect with that and identify what spirit has to offer in our health. Dr. Still identified the celestial realm and the terrestrial realm. And he said that the celestial realm held knowledge and wisdom, whereas the terrestrial realm held motion and power. And so the celestial realm is where we can interpret the word intelligence that we use in the cranial concept as knowledge and wisdom in Dr. Still's words. So intelligence in the cranial concept lies in the celestial realm, whereas potency that we use in the cranial concept lies in motion and power of the terrestrial realm in Still's words. And so we've got these two forces from the breath of life that Dr. Sutherland called it, whereas Dr. Still used the term life. If you look at the word life in all of his writings, it's always this desire to understand what is pushing us, what is making us, how we are created. And what he determined was that there's a reciprocity between the celestial and the terrestrial to create biogen. And if you think of the embryo, you've got the amniotic fluid above and the yolk sac below, and in between is the disc of the embryo. The amnion represents the celestial, the yolk sac represents the terrestrial, and in between is chi, or life. The Chinese like to call the amnion the heavens and the yolk sac the earth and the embryonic disc chi. We can say the celestial and the terrestrial and life, or the breath of life. Those three components are what create our form. And it turns out my questioning of the breath of life tells me that The cerebral spinal fluid is fluctuating at the slow tide in the heavens or the celestial, whereas the arterial pulsation is at the fast tide. And the interstitial fluid is at the fast tide. So you got cerebral spinal fluid moving at a slow tide, the terrestrial moving at a fast tide, and the slow tide is a carrier wave for the fast tide. The carrier wave means that it promotes it. That means we can use these tides to promote health. That's how we apply spirit to our practice. And we're working with biogen, which is in the center, that embryonic disc. That's life.
So it seems like one aspect of how, I think the question was, how do we apply this? How do we apply or use spirituality? And I think over and above everything that Paul said, one aspect of it, the fact that we are here discussing this, having an awareness of this is a big deal. Like the people say, just, admitting that you have a problem is a big step, right? So, and being aware that this phenomena exists and can be accessed is a big step on the way to understanding it.
So I have something I want to say about where I was when I started medical school, because I was borderline atheist agnostic, somewhere in there. I had no belief of anything more than this life. And I was going through first and second year of med school, having a real rough time of it. And it wasn't until I noticed that when I started picking up people's feet in lab, I would go to the edge of the table and pick up my partner's feet, and I started seeing a ghosted overlay of the person, and in the ghosted overlay they were doing something in that, and that really was so weird to me, and it really just shocked me. And so I became curious about, what is this, and is anybody else seeing this? And I started noticing that when I would hold people's heads, I would get tingly feeling, and they would start to tell me that they could feel tingles when I was holding their heads, and it was like I was in a electrical connection with my patients, and with my on my third year rotations. It got very strange, and I had a lot of questions about this. And the more I leaned into it, and the more I started looking at it, it took me to the old works to see what the old osteopaths were saying, because my preceptors had no idea what I was talking about, and and I was having all of these very strange experiences that turned me into a believer of so much more. My patients taught me so much in this, and then the old osteopaths showed up for me. So I now when I'm teaching the students, I find myself asking a higher power often to help them see more. And we see so much more with our hands, and it seems like when I am working hand over hand with the students, that they become believers as well. So
Do you still feel that, Heather?
feel what? Yeah,
Tingles
it's
and
been very strange since then, and now I'm experiencing more of a chant. Oh, this is really out there, I know, but you guys probably know what I'm
no, it's
talking
not.
about.
That's
This one's
why I
normal.
asked. This is much more common than you suggest. we
Before I
get-
go into a room, I usually will I usually will say something to the effect of outside the door before I knock on it. It's may may I be of service in love in this room.
There
And
you
as I go
go.
in, I usually ask
Mhm.
in my mind when I put my hands on them, how may I be of service? And then I step out of the way. And a lot of times I feel this tingly energy come through me, and I am just there as a channel, and I follow. I'll close my eyes and I'll see the ghosted image doing something, and I lean into the intuition of that, and my hands are guided by a divine source.
Well, Heather, my experiences are um, in a way similar. I've said for a long time to people that there seem to be things occurring when I'm with patients that I cannot explain on the basis of anything I ever learned in school. Um, and I didn't know whether to be afraid of it or, or what, but my response to it has always been, okay, there's something there. I don't really know what it is, but at the same time, something's happening here and people are getting better. And so I have a similar thought in my mind at those moments that is something like, if there is healing to take place, then I am here to be a facilitator if needed, you know. And I tend to feel energy coming in to me and into the patient. Sometimes when it goes into the patient and comes back to me, it makes me feel like there's something about the situation that the patient isn't ready to tell me yet, or and at least means that I have more work to do, that type of thing. So I've had those kind of experiences for a long time. And as I grew into this type of thinking and discussion, I guess it was part of my reaction is I not knowing which way to go with it. I didn't deny it, and yet I didn't want to overwhelm it. I just wanted to let it continue and see what I could find out about it as time went on.
Heather, thank you so much for sharing that, because this is exactly why we're having this conversation, is to help normalize talking about things that might feel tricky or individual, because we're having these shared experiences where we're going through medical education, we all have our different practices, but at the same time, we all have like individual experiences too. And it's each person knows what that will be for themselves. And so early on in my osteopathic education, after I had done the introductory course, I had my grandmother transition. She crossed over, but I had my hands on her. And I noticed after they pronounced her, because she was at home, her rhythms, that motion continued. And it was at least 20 minutes. So it was early on, so maybe it was longer. But around that mark, about 22 minutes, then my aunt said, now her spirit has crossed. And I always wondered why she said that. And she doesn't even remember saying that. But I've had more experiences with loved ones when they've crossed over and be able to tend to that. This is not something they teach you in medical school.
My experience was similar. I had heard other people say the same thing, Arlene, that they had palpated their loved one after they had crossed over, and the fluctuation of the tide continued. It might have been a little slower, but it was still there. And when my brother crossed over, I was able for the first time to experience that. And certainly he had a very strong mechanism. He was a strong personality, and he he was present in the room, even though his body had stopped functioning. And so we have to agree that the spirit is the primary part of this system. And that it's what the whole mechanism is built upon, the whole thing is constructed upon, is a spiritual underpinning. And I tend to want to think that the etheric body is the same thing as the soul. And that is where the blueprint resides, which then constructs the connective tissues into which are contained or materialized organs, vessels, nerves, and the like. So the cellular structures are housed by a connective tissue scaffolding that actually is an outpicturing of the soul. Anthroposophical physicians hold that opinion, that indeed the connective tissues or the extracellular fluids are the same thing as the soul. And that's what Dr. Still said. Spirit dwells within the fluids and the extracellular fluids. The fascia is the dwelling place of the soul, he said. So
There's if I can add a little something to that, that when I was at Michigan State, this was sometime after Tom Adams and Dick Heisey, physiologists there, had done their study on cats, trying to measure the craniorhythmic impulse, as they call it, and trying to make the story short, they developed a strain gauge where they could anesthetize a cat and then kind of move the scalp aside, and directly onto the parietal bones they could attach this strain gauge, so that if there was movement in the parietal bones, as we understand it, the gauge would measure that type of widening motion, and also across the sagittal suture, a separation. And they had the gauge validated, so they were pretty trustworthy of it. And Tom and Dick were guys who, if you talk to them, would say two things. They knew nothing about cranial osteopathy. They got some advice from Barbara Briner, who helped them a little bit with the research. And they were physiologists. And so they decided to view the skull as a fluid-filled sphere and look at this motion as compliance, as opposed to like a hinge-like motion that we might think about. Yet nevertheless, they used the strain gauge. And I spoke to the research assistant, and he told me that one time they were had multiple cats hooked up to this thing, and one of the cats passed away from some glitch with the anesthesia or something like that. Well, they were busy, so they just kind of left the cat alone. And when they were finished with the other research that day, he came back and he noticed that the same cranial wave that they were measuring on all these cats was still occurring in this cat. And so he let it alone. And he went and cleaned up the lab and took care of everything else. And finally, it was like 8 o'clock at night. And he said, I got to go home sometime. So he finally unhooked the cat from the apparatus, but the impulse was still occurring. So I've heard different stories. I've not had the experience myself. I had a student when I was at UNE who her brother died, and she was palpating his mechanism, and she could feel it for some time afterwards. I've heard a few mentors over the time mention various time periods. I always wondered, who gets a chance to do that? Like how so who knows how long this thing goes on afterwards, but there is something that it remains after someone transitions for at least some period of time before I guess you could say the transition is really complete somehow, and the second placenta has delivered what it's going to deliver, I guess.
There seems to be a wide variation. When my dad crossed, it was many, many hours, over 8 hours. And so, and I have thoughts on why or what, but I don't want to put any impression that there's a set period of time frame that this happens. This is so, just like birth, every birth is unique, every death is unique as well.
Maybe it has something to do with you know, how long they're knocking on heaven's door or something, you know, you know, who knows what the hours are there.
My belief is that rigor mortis is the end of the fluctuation of fluid.
John Reed raised his hand. John, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, since we're talking about this process, it may also be relative to when people pass. It may be that they haven't, number one, prepared for passing, or number two, all of the soul's business isn't quite done. And there are different rituals in, like in the POA ritual in Tibetan Buddhism, the Lama or the priest closes the doors of the body and opens the top of the skull. You could say with the guided imagination, if you want to use that kind of term, so that the soul has a clear progression and leaves the attachments of the physical world behind. Otherwise, people may be stuck in what they would call the Bardo states, or the intermediate levels of vibration between heaven and the celestial realm. So there may be spiritual rituals that a helping presence. These people would have been called psychopomps, people that have helped the transition of the soul from this existence to the next one, kind of like the midwife making sure the placenta is delivered. There are some rituals that may help that. So part of the variation that one feels may be the person is still working for it through detaching from the physical matter reality. It may not be intrinsic to the physiology. It may be related to the meaning journey of that particular soul. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. And Rebecca, I know, well, I'll take one more question and then we'll keep going. Rebecca, do you want to unmute?
Sure. Yeah. Just so you were kind of already headed where I was going to when you started talking about like a midwife, right? So if it's a second birth, like births don't just happen in a certain particular time and then we are born, right? So there's long births, there's short, all sorts of. So the one person I put my hands on was about an hour and 15 minutes till this rocking kind of stopped, and then away they went.
Thank you. Thank you. I love this conversation and I really appreciate everyone like contributing to it and all the different viewpoints and perspectives. So I have a question on a term that you used, Ray. You once spoke of a spiritual fulcrum. And can you describe what you mean by a spiritual fulcrum and what that means to you? And then, and I'll also ask the other panelists too, is what does that mean to you, and how can osteopaths best prepare themselves to integrate spirit into their practice?
No, okay. Well, try and share and see if I can bring a couple of slides up, because you asked about that in an email, so I pulled these couple of slides, and I think the visual helps a lot with it if I can. Yeah, here it is. I put it this way. I mentioned earlier, we talk about body, mind, and spirit. And if we intersect these, we have this little sort of triangular shape in here, if you will, which is sort of the patient, the person, and that we're speaking of. These things need to be balanced, and so we have this combination of balance and awareness of these things within ourselves. And one way to figure this out is with a fulcrum. And this reminds me a little bit of a couple of things. Roland Becker, I did not know Roland Becker personally, but I read his works and listening to people talk about him. It appears that one of the things he was noted for was his emphasis on stillness. and people that have known him sometimes describe when he would treat that he could easily create this stillness that you could feel in the room when he was treating. And so he was at some kind of fulcrum, I guess. We talk about a Sutherland fulcrum and other fulcrums, and I think there's a spiritual fulcrum that we can achieve in ourselves, which is a little bit like the eye in the hurricane. It's an area of quiet and peace and stillness in this chaotic storm that's going on around it. And the fulcrum allows, as you can see here, very easy, little work on one end to move a great deal of weight on the other end. And the whole other thing, we don't need to dwell on this. There's more of a physics lesson than anything else, but it's the same thing. It's the idea that it makes light work out of a heavy load. And so the fulcrum, this is a quote that I had from Ann Wales. Fulcrum is the still point from which you get the power to lift something heavy. If you want to use a crowbar as a lever to lift something heavy, you put it over a still point, a fulcrum, to get the power and the mechanical advantage that you do not have without it. You can shift the fulcrum from place to place and change your operation. So she kind of describes it in that way. And I think in terms of a spiritual fulcrum, it's something that we find in ourselves, by ourselves, for ourselves somehow. And so I think this is where the descriptions of us come from. People have mentioned in the chat yoga, meditation, mindfulness. It could be any number of things that in some way you find that the ability to, somebody else mentioned approaching patients and making sure, we were always taught to get comfortable, feel centered was the word. So whatever you do to prepare yourself to go into a room to see a patient, each time, what is it that you can do very quickly and easy? This is a way of centering yourself. This is a way of finding some spiritual fulcrum that you can go and prepare to explore this area with, as well as others with patients. I said some of them here. Could be anything: meditation, particular religion, philosophy of life, connecting with people, whatever it is and however you describe it. This is why I guess spirituality comes from within ourselves, becomes an individual pathway, and each of us is successful with it in our own way. That might be part of the explanation. So these types of things. And Heather mentioned agnostic, atheist. I don't know. I guess being an atheist is kind of a belief system, isn't it? So maybe it's okay, So so this was a quote I found somewhere. A fulcrum can be a regular chance to take stock, to become empty and open both before and during treatment, open to the wholeness of the patient. It reminds me of T.S. Eliot's quote about the still point, as he called it. And I don't believe he was talking about the cranial still point. He was talking about a still point in one's life, where he expresses it in ways like he says, the still point where there is no dance, but there is only the dance, type of thing like that. So I guess this is the way I see it, and maybe a few examples of how some people experience it. One of my favorite pictures of Dr. Fryman. One time whenever I saw this look in her eyes and in her face, her hands were always attached to a patient, to a child. So that may have been her still point. I don't know, but I'll end that there. So that's what I was talking about with the still point. You can see how it becomes an individual pathway because each of us finds our own still point through some means, and it may be different for each of us, but yet we find the same type of center somehow that allows us an openness and the ability to access and facilitate this process.
So I see a still point in two different ways. There's this still point in space, which is what the center of a hurricane looks like. It's a point in space. Or there's a point in space in your body that isn't working correctly, and it's a pathological fulcrum that has lack of motion. There's a stillness and a point in space there, but there's also a stillness in time in addition to stillness in space. And the stillness in time is when we're treating somebody and all of a sudden the whole mechanism goes into stillness, and it's downloading the information from the breath of life into the system to recreate the original confirmation that we call healing. So that stillness is where consciousness comes in. Consciousness is stillness in time. And the awareness that you mentioned with your slides there, Ray, is just that. And the intelligence that we talk about in the cranial concept is also a part of that consciousness. And so that intelligence comes from stillness. The breath of life is in stillness, just like consciousness. And love is also a force for creation that is in stillness. And so, so many thoughts running through my head, I can't say them all at the same time. But consciousness is the impetus. I should say consciousness is the means by which creation occurs, and love is the motive for creation. And so those two forces in stillness actually create a form and a moving thing through the transformation or the transition from stillness into action that occurs within the fluids in the body. The fluids are the medium through which this activity occurs. And so working with the fluids gives us the opportunity to address all of that spiritual stuff. I think I said what I wanted to.
Very cool.
All that spiritual stuff. Can I quote you on that, Paul?
Yeah, that's quotable.
Arlene, this is such a good opportunity to air all of these different perspectives. There are probably as many philosophies as there are of the 34 people on this call right now. Very different, but all equally valid because it's our spiritual evolution that helps us help our patients in their spiritual evolution. And so I am glad that I don't think he'd be on this call, folks, if he didn't have a great interest in this aspect of life, that we are transitioning into healthcare. We've dedicated ourselves to helping other people. So here we go. I mean, we got most of the answers here. Is how do we actualize it in our contact with our patients? And we've talked about the preparation of our own self, our own spiritual, I do like Heather does. I pray before I go in. Oh Lord, make me thine instrument, manifest through me the gifts you desire to give to me. Lead me where you would have me go. Bring to me those you would have me serve in your name. And that happens. That happens. And that's just one of the aspects of my own spiritual expression that others may have experienced as well. thank you for sharing your spirit with us.
Thank you. I'm so happy that we are having this conversation, and the things that we're saying, that we are spiritual beings. And one of the first steps is actually to have an awareness of our own awareness, to have an awareness that we are spiritual beings. And in doing so, we elevate the conversation and we start to act more purposeful and with more intention. And that's like part of integrating spirit into osteopathy, is to first be aware that we are spiritual beings. For those that are teaching, I guess everyone here is teaching, how are you talking to your patients? How are you talking to students and meeting them where they are, so that the spirit of osteopathy and the nature of our being can be more accessible to them?
So I, at the beginning of the school year, I decided that I was going to start going off script, even though some of my mentors had advised me to stay on script, because our training in the beginning, in the first and second year, is very algorithmic, and I see the wisdom in that for sure, you know, because we're introducing a whole new concept with using our hands to treat our patients, but also I started pulling in the green book to my lectures, and I was assigned the diaphragms of the body, and I got into the breath and diaphragms, and I let Still do a lot of the talking, but also I took a chance and I started bringing in some of the experiences that I've had in clinic in front of the audience. And afterwards, so Karen Snyder is one of my mentors. I love her to death. She let me know that has not gone over well in the past, and that the students have had evaluations of the professors that come out that say, oh, they're teaching, you know, this is religion. This is not why we're here. But I continued to do it because I felt inspired to do it. And the reviews just came out and not one said anything negative about any of the stuff that I said. And the students want to hear more about that. They do. They just do. And I'm really glad I took that chance, and I spoke from the heart space. I mean, it was a chance for reals. I could have really done myself in with some of the stuff that I've presented in the front of the class, but I think the new generation is much more open. They think differently. They have the internet, you know. And with the internet and the new AI stuff coming out, it makes a lot of things seem possible, you know, where in the past it might not have seemed so possible. Maybe. All right.
It sounds like you were speaking from your heart, and perhaps that made a difference. Perhaps it's so many things in our times and what they've been experiencing and what they haven't had answers to. And yes, medicine is both a science and an art. And I've heard many people here like refer to poetry or other writing that's outside of osteopathy to be able to talk about and explain certain phenomena that we don't always have language for in medicine. And so how do we make sense of something that is mysterious and elusive and in this both science and art? And I know John Reed has his hand up too, so if you'd like to unmute, you can.
I felt impelled just to share something about the context of this. This meeting is very special. But if you think of the times that we're in, I was reading a book by an indigenous person talking about, this is the end of a big age of humanity is the end of a 20,000-year cycle, and there's lots of cycles that are coming to an end in these moments that we're living. There's the cycle of oppression and greed and capitalism. There's the cycle of gender differentiation and the lack of a recognition of the importance of the feminine energy to keep society intact and responsive. And if you think about medicine, most of us grew up in a culture that was highly influenced by the academic history of the Middle Ages in Europe, where the church said, we got the soul and you guys just have the body. And if anybody that's not part of the church tries to do something that's in the soul, we're going to get rid of them, which, ended up with the deaths of lots of women who knew about herbs and how to talk to them and talk to people. And so that's infected all the rest of us. Oh, you don't dare talk about those things. That's not medicine. Well, I'm really pleased for the feedback from Heather, because I was hoping that we're in a time that people have birthed to help this change to the new kind of human, which means their minds are going to be able to process this and be able to hold both the immaterial and the material, the transcendent and the material at the same time. And we all need to be willing to speak up about that in some way that portrays we're speaking from the heart and speaking with love, no matter who we're talking to. Be part of the time, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was great.
I think it reminds me of another way that you sort of apply this in practice. And I remember reading in, I won't remember the exact articles, but I remember reading in some of Dr. Fryman's articles over the years that she would talk about treating patients, often gave examples of patients in her writings. And she used to use the phrase, asking the silent question. Hollis, I don't know if you ran into that in her work and her writings, but anytime, but I guess especially time when you feel like there's something going on that you haven't discovered with the patient, or something's keeping the progress. And her phrase was, ask the silent question. And the silent question was, what is your deepest need? And it reminds me of another article I read by a guy named Littlejohn, who was a surgeon, I think, and he did a lengthy article, but my interpretation of it is he boiled down all the osteopathic principles we talked about into one principle. What is the obstruction to the patient's health? So that's another way to ask the question. Like, you just ask, what is your deepest need today? What is the obstruction to your health that I can help with? And again, I don't go after it, I wait for it, and it manifests somehow.
The intelligence of the tide is accessible to us all and is something that we can all use as a means of understanding the patient better, understanding ourselves better, and understanding creation better. And what I've learned in asking the intelligence of the tide is that light is the intermediary between the breath of life and physiology, and that waves of light are what stimulates the fluctuation of the cerebral spinal fluid, whereas particles of light are what causes potency to happen in the body. And so waves of light are infinite. There is no location of a wave of light. It is everywhere at once and has perfect, infinite intelligence. It knows everything about everything. Whereas a particle has been changed by consciousness into something that is usable in physical reality and can be located. Well, the particle is in the potency, in the vasculature and the interstitial space, whereas the wave is in the cerebral spinal fluid, the intelligence. Those are pretty important characteristics that we have to operate with. And light is the intermediary. Dr. Sutherland said there's liquid light. And if you pay attention, you can see that light. As the treatment unfolds, you'll see white light come into where there used to be no light, where there wasn't any motion, where the fluid was stagnant, where there was dysfunction. And then suddenly light comes in and your treatment is done.
Bob Bishop is raising his hand if you want to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Dr. Fryman, in one of her articles, pointed me towards Ralph Waldo Emerson and his essay on the Oversoul is something I've used in a lot of lectures. From within or from behind, there is a light which shines upon us or through us and makes us aware that we are nothing and the light is all. That's all.
Very nice.
Beautiful.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you. We're nearing towards the last 10 minutes. So if there's any questions, then you can either raise your hand or put it in the comments, or unmute. Miriam, where are you? If you
I-
want to
So
unmute.
sorry to come late. I'm looking forward to seeing the recording. Yeah, I haven't been able to put into words the experience that I feel when I treat. And since I'm not in a teaching situation much anymore, I yearn to be able to express that. But this has opened up that for me, and I'm glad for the opportunity and continue to explore this. On a physical level, what I notice in seeking where does the body need me most, it is the stuck places. And what does it need in order to get unstuck? It tells me what vector, how much pressure, with the intention of all I want is what you need. But what comes back to me is a very physical thing. And my question is this something other people experience? What comes back to me in the moment of release is a physical pulsation like you get with counterstrain. It's just that strong, a pulsation of theirs, of mine. I don't know where it comes from. And then I usually take a deep breath as well as the patient. And that's the addictive part of it for me, is that I love being involved in that whole process. But I just haven't talked to very many people about that sensation. And I don't want to teach what isn't what some other people at least acknowledge. I don't know. I don't know when I will have the opportunity to talk about it again, but okay, that's enough.
Which is why we have this group here, because we're sharing instead of teaching. We're really sharing.
Miriam, I had a recent experience where I was lecturing on the topic of counterstrain with the first year medical class. And I was talking about this pulse, the therapeutic pulse. And I had a med student yell from the audience, "Is it my pulse or theirs?" And I was like, I don't know. Just trust that it's happening. And yeah. So I don't know.
You think it matters, Heather?
Oh, don't matter. It works.
I'm going to invite Rajiv on here to read something that he wrote. Let me see how to get you up here.
Hi,
There
Raji.
you
Hello. Are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Very
we
good.
hear you.
Okay, so did you read what I wrote on the side?
Can you read it
Yes.
out loud for everyone in case they haven't?
So a great osteopath said, every drop knows the tone. One could say every drop knows the ocean. The drop can know the tide because there's still a duality in that dimension, even though their essence is the same. But once the drop merges with the ocean, that is a different dimension, and there's no way to know. The knowing is gone to a pure know, in a sense, in which there is no sense. It is a timelessness of eternity. So, and to enter that dimension, I could add, is not within the individual will of the human mechanism. To enter that, we have to be taken there. To be taken there, we have to release everything that has to do with our personality, everything that we think we know, everything we think we believe, just everything. And once that happens, if by chance that should happen, then we are taken home. So after Dr. Fulford passed, I started to have, I felt like I lost all my skill as an osteopath. I went through that for a number of years. And I heard Jim Jealous was a very good osteopath, so I wrote him a letter. And I told him, this is my dilemma. Patients are getting better. I'm feeling great. They're feeling good. I have no idea what I'm doing. And I felt bad because, all the stuff I learned in school was out the window. And he wrote back. I never met this man, by the way, before I wrote that letter. And he wrote back and he said, I'd like to come down and spend some time in your office for a couple of weeks. Let me know when I can come. And I was shocked. And I didn't reply back because, I just didn't expect, he doesn't know me. and it wasn't until a number of years later that I think when I took phase 4 from him that I opened up again. I told him, listen, I know your stuff is really great and I'm having these great experiences, but I can't feel a thing. And then he said, look, when we go to the tables, since I have your permission, I'll take a look. And then he said, hey, Raj, man, we'll teach you everything. We can teach you all that stuff. And then, but nothing ever came. And then I would always ask him, we got to be really good friends. And I would always ask him, why can't I see what other people see? And he used to just, he was always very sweet. I never got a response. And it wasn't years later that I realized that there's another dimension. There's osteopathy is, to me, and this is what Dr. Fulford said, it's a science and art. And the science has to do with the material and the art has to do with the spiritual. To enter that spiritual, like I just said, you can't go there and there's nothing logical about it. As you get into more subtle aspects of the existence, logic starts to go away and there's no way to understand. You cannot understand it. And I realized after that it was such a gift to not know, because what it gave me in return is priceless. And I know that now after I lost all this hair, but had I known it back then, I had a jungle up there. I could have had all this hair, but so that's the way I see it. When you enter this other realm, as closer you get You're going to understand less. So your logic will fall apart. Your ability to see will diminish. And if you can be comfortable with that, then that's half the game, to be comfortable with what we don't know. Because when you're in a state of I don't know, when you're in a state of total ignorance, and that can be very painful. Being ignorant can be very painful, but it's a very good pain because that makes you a seeker. Because seeking is about the individual. Religions are about groups. Groups are about a belief. But seeking is about no belief whatsoever because you don't know. Not knowing opens you up to intuition. It opens up to the divine. It opens up to the creator. Something we should really appreciate. Being comfortable with ignorance is a real blessing.
Thank you. This is part of the beautiful paradox of life. And the more we know, the more we don't know. And the more love we give away, the more love we have. So I love to think about those paradoxes of living. Well, we are right at time. And I want to thank everyone. First, our panelists for taking the time to share from your own experiences and for everyone for showing up here as well live, and for those of you that are joining the recording later. If we're in the still point, there's no time or space, then we are still in this sacred space where we're having this amazing conversation. And I want to thank each of you for having the courage to go where we don't really know and to have these conversations because they are essential to being. And our beings are essential to our health. So we don't access the depth of healing unless we are willing to have these conversations where maybe we don't know everything. And so I feel there is a balance of combining our knowing and the love of studying and our education and our experiences with the infinite. So we have both the finite and the infinite. And that paradox is the human existence. And so I'm going to read one last thing here. And this is from Dr. Still, but William Lemley quoted it in his AAO journal article, summer 2002. He says, he once told an early osteopath, "You do not need a medium to get into communication with the infinite. You have this infinity in yourself. Recognize and cultivate it." And that's from Carol Trowbridge's Andrew Taylor Still, 1828 to 1917. So we each, as everyone here has said, we each have this within us. Go within, cultivate it, and share with everyone, because that is the nature of healing. So thank you, everyone, for being here. I will send a note out later for how to access the recording. We'll have the transcript, and we'll have all the notes, and we'll have that up for everyone to view in case you weren't here for the whole time, or for anyone that hasn't been able to join us live. We appreciate each and every one of you, and each of you is essential in this profession on Earth for humanity. So please share your gifts widely and freely, and love freely. Thank you, everyone.